Hello everyone, my name is Joe Johnson. Welcome to the first webinar in our three-part webinar series on emergency management. It is hosted by Esri's Utilities, Water, and Telecommunications teams. Each webinar will address one of the three stages of emergency management: prepare, respond, and recover. Our intent is to show you the resources to help manage operations during what is often a very chaotic time. Today's webinar provides a quick review of the ArcGIS resources that enhance the planning process. We will show examples of data management, analytics, and collaboration. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch in approximately 1 week. Please enter your questions in the questions dialog box at any time during the webinar. Due to the quick 30-minute format, there will not be enough time to answer questions at the end. We will send the answers to your questions in a document along with the link to the recording. Joining me today are several of my colleagues: Bill Meehan, Director of Electric Utilities Solutions; Tyler Pilarczyk, a solution engineer who supports our electric, gas, and telecom team; and finally, Jason Isherwood, a solution engineer who supports the Esri Water team. Here is our agenda for today. Bill will give us an overview of the webinar series. Tyler and Jason will show what data is available for nearly any kind of emergency and how network vulnerability impacts the planning process. Tyler will then illustrate how this supports an emergency management plan, and Bill will do a quick wrap-up. So at this time, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to pass it over to my colleague, Bill Meehan.
Thanks, Joe, and thank you for attending. Over the course of these three webinars, we will address how GIS technology can enhance, supplement, and even transform the way utilities and telecoms manage disasters. Today, we will deal with prepare, those actions that need to happen before an anticipated event. Next week, we'll discuss response, how GIS can better manage processes while the event is going on or just after. Then in 2 weeks, we'll show how GIS supports utilities and telecoms after the event is passed. This is the recover stage. We'll show how GIS can help rebuild our network as quickly and as efficiently as possible. During these three stages, we will learn. That's about learning. What worked and what didn't, and use that learning for future events. You know, Esri has a unique purpose to help solve some of the world's most difficult problems through the power of location. So should a disaster hit your area, Esri will be there for you. For over 20 years, the Esri Disaster Response Program has provided GIS support to our users and the global community. We provide the world's leading GIS software. We help organizations rapidly implement digital workflows at scale. We give access to authoritative geospatial data and information sets. And we ensure those who need it most will see the right information when they need it. And finally, we'll provide 24/7 technical support. So Esri will be working the disaster, not just for your company, but for government, first responders, and agencies, such as the Red Cross. You can deploy many of the technologies we will show you today during, I know this sounds crazy, but during something called routine emergencies, business as usual. There will always be someone crashing into a pole or digging into a fiber line or water main, causing outages. The idea, though, is to scale up to these significant events, organizing around people, process, and technology. There are lots of processes in this whole time of emergency management, like decentralization, routing, dispatch, staging, housing, meals, getting meals for crews, material handling, and more, virtually all dealing with location. And technology, SCADA, network monitoring systems, network analysis systems, several three-letter acronym systems like OMS, AMI, WMS, ERP, all typically dedicated standalone systems. And of course, people. They often bring their legacy behavior, especially during times of great stress. People revert to what they know best, what has worked in the past. The greater the danger, the more they fall back to legacy. Paper, map books, pens, pencils, yellow pads, and spreadsheets. So how many of you still see those crazy manila folders stuffed with paper? So what are the issues? Well, it's a puzzle to solve. disparate data from spreadsheets to disparate systems. It's a lack of analysis, in effect, a lack of good science. It's silos of processes. And maybe the biggest problem of all is the lack of collaboration, which inhibits communication and coordination when you need it the most. So ArcGIS pulls the pieces of the puzzle together. It consumes data from all of the technology shown above, from SCADA to ADMS to metering to financial to traffic and weather services. It organizes by location, breaking down silos. It provides advanced analytics using technologies like machine learning and augmented reality. And it provides situational awareness to all, making sure that we're all on the same page, answering the question, what's going on right now? One of my favorite thought leaders is this guy named Simon Sinek. He once quipped, more information is always better than less. Well, I worked for a power company for 2 decades in the northeastern United States. Off and on, I had the responsibility for electric operations, which included working the restoration of major outages. We had big storms like ice, wind, snowstorms, hurricanes, and brutal thunder and lightning. It's funny. I always seemed to need more information than I got. I had to make some pretty important decisions, like when to call in foreign crews or when to declare an emergency. Decision making was tough when you didn't have the data you needed at the time. But funny, the irony was that the information I needed was somewhere. Somebody had it. It was just difficult to locate, or simply I just didn't know where it was, or the data was just out of date. Most of the information we need has one thing in common: location. That's why GIS is so important for emergency management. It organizes everything by location. Then ArcGIS reveals patterns. The underlying theme of our webinar series is that the ArcGIS platform provides decision makers, field crews, and support staff more information than ever before. It delivers great data. It sharpens insight and streamlines communication, coordination, and collaboration in real time. Okay, so let's now talk about how we can prepare before the event. Today, we're going to discuss the 3 elements we need to prepare for an event, regardless of what kind of an event there is. The first is external impacts, usually from Mother Nature, but not always. The second is network vulnerability. Where are there places in our network that needs addressing? And lastly, we'll discuss the plan. Now that we understand the impact and network vulnerability, how do we make and take that insight and craft plans to leverage that impact during a disaster? Understanding the where of external impacts is the first step in advanced planning for anticipated event. This slide shows a sample of the kinds of external events that are likely to happen. All are about location. And as I said earlier, the whole learning process is the key element of emergency management, knowing the patterns of emergencies that foster that learning. So I'm going to turn to Tyler now. So Tyler, show us how ArcGIS makes that easy, that learning easy and compelling. Take it away, Tyler.
All right, thanks, Bill. So one of the first steps in emergency management is understanding the emergencies that you're susceptible to. Fortunately, the Esri Living Atlas has a variety of data sets that can help us understand what we're vulnerable to and where those vulnerabilities are at. Now, as a resident of Southern California, I can confidently tell you that I'm in an area that's prone to wildfires. But what I couldn't tell you off the top of my head are the specific parts of my region that pose the greatest threat to a fire. So we've brought in a layer that uses several different factors to help us assess this. One, we're going to look at landscape, or the fuels that either trigger or promote the growth of these fires. We're also looking at topology and accessibility. So if a fire were to start, how quickly can someone get on site and help put it out? In a similar light, we can also look at earthquake risk according to the frequency and magnitude of these earthquakes and where they're taking place. We can also leverage our partners' data sets like the USGS to assess some other vulnerabilities. So in this case, they play out several different earthquake scenarios to help us understand the kind of impact those earthquakes could potentially have. So in our example, the epicenter would be right where that gold star is. And once I bring in those USGS shake maps, we can start to see the magnitude and the different areas that are going to be impacted by this potential earthquake. Zooming back out, we can also take a look at flood hazard areas. Now, those purple areas are classified as those with a 1% chance of an annual flood. If I zoom into Florida, we'll see plenty of purple areas, but we also know that this area is prone to hurricanes as well. And unlike these hazard areas, it would be the entire state that's susceptible to any kind of hurricane during that season. What we can do is bring in another real-time data set looking at active hurricanes. So in this example, we have the storm that's right outside the coast there, and we can see its projected path. And because of that, we can see where that path overlays those flood hazard areas that would really point out those areas that are going to be prone to flooding during that hurricane. So just by overlaying multiple data sets, we can start to gather even more insight into what we're vulnerable to. Another great example like this is around what we're all dealing with right now, which is COVID-19. We're also working with our partners in this space to understand how many cases of COVID-19 have been documented and where are those cases at. And that's what we see right now in those red dots. We've also set this on top of our social vulnerability layer because that's going to allow us to not only see where we're having a lot of cases, but where are those communities that we're seeing a lot of cases that are that much more vulnerable to the pandemic. Now at this point, I'm going to zoom into a service territory we have in Northern California. I'm going to start to bring in my local layers. So for example, I brought in our FEMA floodplains, our wind intensity maps, and our fire hazard severity zones. And again, by overlaying this information, we can start to pinpoint areas that we're going to be very susceptible to wind damage or fire, to a wildfire or even flooding. Now that we have an idea of the emergencies we're susceptible to, we can now start to bring in network data and our network assets to really understand what kind of impact these emergencies have in the services that we provide, the customers we serve, and our own staff. So Bill, what are some of your thoughts here?
Well, first of all, I love that the wind map, because that really reminds me about this notion of continuous learning. You know, when I worked for the power company, much of the insight of employees came from their lived experience. You know, it reminds me of an old colleague when I worked at the power company called Stanley. And he could tell me where wind always seemed to be greater. So where the poles were likely to fall during a snowstorm or, you know, a windstorm or something. He just knew. He learned about the impacts of network vulnerability. Great. But then he retired, taking all of that learning with him. Tyler illustrated how ArcGIS, with all its available data and functionality, can institutionalize that learning. As Simon Sinek said, more information is always better than less. So now that we know where the external impacts are likely to strike, let's examine how our networks react, where they are weak or will be most affected by external factors. Jason will demonstrate how ArcGIS helps us better understand our network's behavior. Jason?
Thanks, Bill. So like Tyler said, once you understand what hazards may pose a risk to your community, you can then begin to investigate how your assets may be impacted by them. As an example of this, let's explore how we can use ArcGIS to quickly identify impacts on our network, which in this case is a water distribution system. So here I have a web app displaying this water distribution system, which includes pipes, valves, hydrants, connections, etc. We can see that there's a large river running right through town, and preliminary hazard investigation identified flooding as a potential hazard. So we want to better understand the risk to nearby assets and infrastructure in our system. By overlaying FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer, which is publicly available for most of the country, we can investigate assets that could be potentially inundated and possibly damaged as a result of this flood. In this case, I'm going to focus on the special flood hazard area, or the 1% annual chance floodplain, meaning there's a 1% chance that this flood will occur every year, shown on our map with the transparent dark blue and hashed floodway area. We can intersect our water distribution system assets with these floodplain boundaries to quickly analyze system impacts, such as water mains in the floodplain. We can also identify other assets in our network that will be impacted, such as valves, hydrants, and service connections. Doing this simple analysis enables us to quickly visualize where we have potential flooding risks in our system. Here we have a treatment plant whose facility and associated infrastructure would be almost entirely inundated as a result of this flood. And identification of these vulnerable facilities and locations is essential during the planning process. Additionally, we can identify clusters of susceptible assets, such as this area off East Porter Avenue. Here we have hydrants, valves, and properties that are at risk of flooding, and both of these areas may be good candidates for flood mitigation planning efforts. Like Tyler said, it's also important to consider other data sources that may impact your community during the planning process in order to further qualify and prioritize susceptible locations. In this case, we're looking at a COVID-19 vulnerability index by census tract, which can give us a greater understanding of the vulnerabilities that exist within our community specifically, and how we can use that information to further prioritize our planning. Now I want to focus on another area right by City Hall here. It looks like we have a bridge that would be overtopped as a result of this flood. And since there's a water main, as well as some other assets for my water distribution system in this area, perhaps we want to analyze the impacts to our network here. Let's say this water main, which I'll put a pin on, is damaged during this flood, perhaps from debris from high velocity floodwaters or some other reason for the break itself. And we want to understand or see what valves we would need to close in order to isolate this area and how our system would be impacted. Because we're leveraging the utility network data model, we can analyze scenarios and run traces with different parameters for planning purposes. During the normal course of operations, we can see that there are two valves that we would need to close, which would result in this outage area and a relatively small impact on our system overall. However, due to the potentially flooded area, we're actually not able to access this valve on the north side of the bridge as it was identified as an impacted asset, and in this case would be inaccessible. We can actually rerun our trace and skip this valve to see what the impacts or the outage extent would be in this particular scenario. This ability to analyze different network scenarios can help us understand the impact a flood like this might have on our system, and this is a really important planning tool for us. We can now see that we have 4 system valves that we need to close in order to isolate this area, and our water outage extends north to Jefferson Avenue, resulting in a larger impact to our service area, including several service connections. So now that you've seen how we can leverage floodplain data to analyze impacts to our system, let's explore how you can use ArcGIS to get additional insight into your network and identify those especially vulnerable locations. To do this, let's explore underground assets and how a potential earthquake might impact them. So from a previous condition assessment analysis, I have information that shows me my water mains, as well as the number of breaks that each segment has experienced over the past year. While we know that a number of factors, such as asset age, can contribute to failure, I want to extend this analysis and look at soil factors that could be making my network more vulnerable. The USGS publishes soil information to the living atlas of the world that contains steel and concrete corrosivity risk zones. I can investigate the total number of mains in my service area by steel corrosion zone and where my steel pipes specifically might be in relation to these zones. Similarly, I can investigate how my network might be impacted by concrete corrosion as well, and where my pipes are in relation to those risk zones. Leveraging data sources like this may help explain the breakage patterns the system is experiencing. And like we've already seen, understanding where these vulnerable assets are located is essential for proper planning. But how would an earthquake event actually impact this system? Luckily for us, resources exist to help us understand these potential impacts. For this analysis, I'm interested in how an earthquake might impact the soils where my pipes are located. So I want to look at soil liquefaction potential. In case folks aren't familiar with liquefaction, it's a process that's often caused by earthquake-induced ground shaking, where water-saturated sediment begins to act like a fluid. As we might expect, this process can have devastating impacts on infrastructure during an earthquake event. In our area, we have liquefaction zones ranging from none to a high potential for the soil to liquefy. If we overlay our water mains, we can begin to understand how ground shaking from an earthquake may impact our underground infrastructure. By spatially aggregating our water mains and break counts with liquefaction potential zones, we can see that while we had more breaks in very low and low risk zones, there's an alarming trend here that shows a high number of breaks in an area with a high potential for liquefaction. Looking at system and hazard vulnerability together, we can identify areas potentially prone to failure during an earthquake event. By highlighting those assets located in high liquefaction potential zones that are also at a high risk of corrosion due to their material type, we can narrow down these especially problematic areas. Here we've isolated an area with a high liquefaction potential that is also at a high risk of concrete pipe corrosion with a large number of asbestos concrete pipes in the vicinity. This area looks to be a good candidate for a proactive pipe replacement or modernization project, but at a minimum, we at least need to be aware of this especially vulnerable hotspot in our network so that we can plan accordingly. So over the course of just the last few minutes, we combine our assets with publicly available hazard data sets, identified susceptible areas throughout our network, and narrowed that down even further to uncover hotspots where we might be able to predict asset failure might occur during an event itself. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. This gives us a great roadmap for mitigation. We can also look at the actions we just didn't have time to do. So, for example, falling trees impact overhead and telecom and electric lines. We can show where we haven't done tree trimming recently. We can show where we have just forgotten to do stuff or we have low priority tasks. Tyler illustrated the external factors that we really need to understand fully if we were to perform emergency management. And I recall a time when we were planning to stage crews in a big parking lot. What we didn't know was that the parking lot was in a low-lying area subject to flooding. At the time, no one had access to a flood map. It's critically important to have that data well in advance. And as Jason talked, it's also vital to understand the weaknesses of our network, also well in advance of an event. With that information, we can know how to create the foundation for an emergency management plan. Learning about impacts and network vulnerability, we can look at potential consequences, which help us to develop science-based plans for how to deal with an emergency, even though we don't know and can't know the exact situation. But we can know a lot going into it. So Tyler, help us understand how GIS and location sharpens our planning process. Tyler?
Sure, thanks, Bill. So similar to what we saw from Jason, we also ran an analysis to understand the vulnerability of our network. And we did this doing a couple of things. We first incorporated the layers we saw in the beginning of our demos. So looking at wildfire hazards, flooding, flood zones, and wind tunnels. And then we also looked at the history of the asset. So has the asset exceeded its lifespan? Has it exceeded its inspection cycle? Has the damage been reported the last time this asset has been inspected? And with that, we can now start to filter our polls in this case according to the health of that asset and filter to only show those with the highest vulnerabilities. And now we can start to see clusters of assets that are likely to fail in the event of an emergency. With that, we can now start putting together our emergency management plan. To do that, we first need to understand where we have critical facilities, such as police stations, fire stations, hospitals. We can even start to bring in additional medical facilities that we can open up in the event of a crisis. So these could be facilities that we've opened right now to respond to COVID-19 that we can then reuse for a future emergency. It's also important to understand where we have critical customers, like those that are on life support. Those kind of customers that if the power were to go off, they would face the greatest or the largest of consequences. After that, we need to understand where we have our evacuation centers that, should people have to evacuate, would be the evacuation centers that people would stay at. On top of that, we can also look at our evacuation routes. So understanding how people will evacuate this area in the event of emergency. That way, as we are responding to activity on the network, we can understand these routes that are being heavily leveraged by the public and use that information to help better route our staff in the field. It's also important to make sure that we're collaborating with other entities within our area. So if I'm an electric company, and I may want to know where we have communication towers that serve this area. So I can work with my local telecom provider and understand where those locations are at. Now, on the flip side, if I was the communications provider, I would want to know when the power company is experiencing outages and how soon the company, the utility expects to restore power. After that, we can look at hotels that we would store or we would use when we are bringing in foreign crews to repair or to respond to an emergency. We can also look at prospective staging areas where we can deploy equipment and trucks. And you'll notice as we are going through each of these staging areas that we're also looking at drive time buffers around these areas. This helps us understand how quickly our trucks can get to different parts of our network, whether it's a 5-minute drive, 10-minute drive, or 15-minute drive. Once we have all this information together, we can start to run scenarios like a flood event. So, seeing the areas that would experience severe flooding, we can now bring back our vulnerable assets that we saw on the last dashboard to understand which of those assets will be the first to fail in this case. Now, although we do have critical facilities outside these flood areas, like our hotel, fire station, and potential staging area, we can also see that flooding may cause some of these roads to be completely inaccessible. So even though they're not technically flooded, these facilities are just not accessible. Another scenario we can play out is in the event of a wildfire. So here we can see the start of a potential wildfire and its projected path across our service territory. And now we can see those facilities that have intersected the fire's path, like the staging area in this medical facility, as well as those that are just outside of this area that can still be impacted. It's also important that when considering this emergency, understanding which parts of our network fall within an area that the wildfire may impact. And then from there, we can start to make decisions on do we completely turn off the power for this entire circuit, or is there certain areas that we can turn off power given the current conditions? So Bill, putting this all together, what are some more of your thoughts here?
Well, thanks, Tyler. One of the things I noticed when you showed that network is that part of the network is in the fire zone and another part, or what the potential fire zone, and the other part is outside of it. So let's say we had to make a decision to turn off the power. We'd certainly want to do that. But the problem is we don't want to turn off the power in areas that are still maybe serving critical customers or important areas. So as we look at this sort of scenario, we could say, well, wait, let's put some disconnecting switches along this circuit so that we could segment that part of the circuit, and I'm talking about in advance of a fire, segment that part of the circuit so that we could, in fact, turn off the power if we saw that the fire was going in the other direction. And that would be, if the wind was blowing in one direction, we'd probably want to turn off the whole system. If not, we would do something else. So once we pulled our information together, our plan becomes so much clearer. Don't place material staging areas in flood zones. Know where shelters will be impacted. Know that certain critical infrastructures will be threatened. Then we can mitigate, just like I talked about. So, what are the key takeaways from the prepare stage of emergency management? Well, first, consume as much impact data from as many sources as you can. Of course, use GIS to align those, like demographic, topology, even COVID-19 data. As Cynic said, more information is always better than less. Well, I'll add a caveat to that, only if you organize it by location in a GIS. And two, get a complete and full understanding of the network. That means analysis, pulling in data from disparate systems. Know your network. And number three is create the foundation for your company's emergency management plans. This should include planning for foreign crews, staging areas, backup generator plans, or where we could inject power into the network should we lose transmission. Hotel locations for foreign crews, for example, even supply chain data. It is all spatial. Then you are ready when the storm, the earthquake, the flood, or the fire, or whatever hits. So that's prepare. Back to you, Joe.
Thanks, Bill, Tyler, and Jason. That was an awesome demo. As I stated in the beginning, we will be sending out answers to your questions along with the recording of this webinar soon. We hope that we have stimulated your thinking about how to prepare for an emergency event and look forward to your participation next when we have when we address how GIS can be a key technology while responding to the event. Thanks, everyone, and hope to see you next week.